Ladies and gentlemen, the Prime Minister.
The battle of Britain is about to begin. Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization. If we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, including all that we have known and cared for, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duty. So bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour.
It's time for Radical Truth with Tony Gurley.
What would you say if you found out that the ultimate purpose of the lockdowns was to close the churches? I'm not saying that it is. And folks, I'm going to allow you to come to your own conclusion. And in the next 30 minutes, you will know why my proclamation is make churches full again. Now, I'm going to present to you a number of news stories and a couple of videos, and perhaps you'll come to a more informed conclusion in less than 30 minutes from now. Now, here's the thing, folks. When it comes to the lockdowns, it's because we are in the midst of the greatest disease in the history of the world, or we are in the midst of the greatest hoax in the history of the world. That is the dichotomy. In other words, the polar opposite of the views that different people have. There are people who hold one of those two views throughout the world. And of course, many of you and a ton of people out there hold a view somewhere in between, even though your view may lean more towards one side or the other. Again, the greatest disease or the greatest hoax. What is the reason for the lockdowns? We're going to cover, again, a number of new stories, but before we get to those, I want to point you to a 3-part series that was done back in May. We covered the news stories that were out around that time. Now, you may not have heard or seen those news stories, or there are a number of videos in that 3-part series as well. This is episodes 6, 7, and 8. Again, government, gray state, and God. Watch or listen to those and compare that with this episode, which is episode 29 now, which you can put together, and we have that 6-month hindsight that we're presenting to you now. Now, here is a map that just was out, it's still available right now, but this is a screenshot from a day or two ago, I believe, and this is CNN.com, and this map shows you how many cases and deaths have happened in the world. The darker the red, the more cases are in those particular countries. Now, cases here are listed as 58,615,834. That is a lot. And the deaths, 1,387,179. And that sounds like a lot as well. And as a disclaimer, folks, any death due to any disease is unfortunate. But we do need to talk about the numbers here, and we do need to do some very important math. Because what happens when you divide 1,387,179 deaths and divide that by 58,615,834 cases? What you will come up with is 0.02 death rate. Now let's look at the United States in particular. How many cases? It has here 12,229,265. Deaths, 256,746. Once again, divide 256,746 by 12,229,265. And once again, 0.02. Now, there are people out there who are genuinely very scared about this. And if you opened up the whole country tomorrow and said, okay, everybody go back to normal, there are people out there who would just decide to stay home. And those persons should not be penalized for that, especially if they have a pre-existing condition, if they're elderly, and so on. But we need to also have a knowledge of the CDC's revealing statistics. And here is this news story, which came out on November 16th. It says, what WTH, You can put in a couple words for the H there. CDC lists 26,557 heart attacks as COVID deaths. Lists 7,919 accidents and poisonings as COVID deaths. Now, folks, let's check out our first video.
The latest numbers from the CDC reveal hospitals have been counting patients who died from serious pre-existing conditions as COVID-19 deaths. One America's Pearson Sharp has more as the CDC counts over 51,000 patients who died from heart attacks as opposed to coronavirus.
The Centers for Disease Control have updated their death counts for coronavirus and reveal yet again that COVID-19 is rarely the actual cause of death among coronavirus patients. According to the CDC themselves, of the 220,000 deaths attributed to the coronavirus, 87,000 of them died from pneumonia and influenza. Another 17,000 died from chronic respiratory diseases, and 26,000 died from respiratory distress syndrome. 44,000 patients died from hypertensive diseases, 23,000 died from heart disease, and a whopping 28,000 died from cardiac arrest and heart failure. Yet all of these, even patients who died from heart attacks, were marked down as dying from the coronavirus. Doctors who spoke with One American News explained that 131,000 patients who are being considered COVID-19 deaths already had life-ending diseases, including cancer, dementia, and even end-stage renal failure. And according to the CDC again, if you look at place of death, you'll see that some 10,000 patients who died from COVID were on hospice care, meaning they were terminally ill to begin with and were already expected to die. Doctors tell One American News that all of these patients were critically ill and likely died from their pre-existing conditions without any help from the coronavirus. However, they explain that the CARES Act, passed by Congress in March, gives hospitals a 20% bonus on their diagnosis-related group paid for by Medicare. Essentially, that means doctors are being paid to list deaths as coronavirus without any indication the patient's death was actually COVID-related.
Okay, so there is a huge difference here and a major distinction that people need to realize. There's a difference between dying with COVID and dying from COVID. Now, let's combine this with a few more news stories. Major peer-reviewed study finds masks don't work. This came out November 18th. Top Canadian pathologist tells Alberta government COVID is the greatest hoax ever perpetrated on an unsuspecting public. Folks, this article says the doctor said that nothing could be done to stop the spread of the virus besides protecting older, more vulnerable people, and that the whole situation represented politics playing medicine, and that's a very dangerous game. Next story that came out November 21st. More new research shows only those with symptoms spread COVID-19. Masks, school closings, and lockdowns couldn't have been more pointless. Now, also, these are the relative size of different particles here. Now, that big snake-looking thing there is a human hair. Now, smaller than that, we have fine beach sand. Smaller than that, a grain of salt. Smaller than that, white blood cell. Smaller than that, grain of pollen. Smaller than that, a dust particle. Smaller than that, red blood cell. Smaller than that, respiratory droplets. Smaller than that, a dust particle. Smaller than that, a bacterium. Smaller than that, wildfire smoke. And smaller than wildfire smoke, you have coronavirus. Now, folks, when you realize the size of coronavirus particles and compare that to all this other stuff, I mean, this is pretty much like wearing, especially if you're talking about the basic cotton masks, not the N95, which actually do something other than give you a headache, but the cotton masks, compared to these particles here, I mean, this is like wearing a mask made of chain link fencing and having sand thrown at your face. And the news stories right before this should make this point very clear, or the opposite. This picture here should make those news stories very clear. Now, it's been said that the panic is worse than the pandemic. And sadly, the impact this has made in some people's lives due to other people's response to it won't be easily forgotten. And folks, when we come back after the break, we're going to get to these sad news stories, but many more after that. Because again, I want you to come to an informed conclusion here at the end of this episode.
As a 501c3 Christian ministry, Radical Truth is dependent upon God to provide our monthly financial support, and He provides through people like you who realize the need for this vital work. Your regular prayers and monthly financial gifts allow us to continue our full-time effort to equip the body of Christ with the training necessary to effectively engage Muslims with the gospel of Jesus Christ. At Radical Truth, we proclaim the truth, share the gospel, and expose Islam. Please partner with us by visiting radicaltruth.net and making a tax-deductible donation. That's radicaltruth.net.
Understand that this is a spiritual battle. Muslims are bound up by the enemy. Paul writes in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 3 and 4, he says, even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing, whose minds the God of this age has blinded, who do not believe, lest the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God, should shine on them. These are people whose minds the God of this age has blinded. And we're the only ones that can bring them the message that will set them free.
This is Radical Truth with Tony Gurley.
Folks, before the break, I mentioned a few heartbreaking news stories, and I want to share those with you now. Troubling new report reveals how lockdown harms young children. This article says a UK education watchdog said some young children have forgotten how to eat with a knife and fork, and others have regressed back into diapers as coronavirus lockdown measures and related school closures take a toll on young peoples. Lockdowns haven't brought down COVID mortality, but they have killed millions of jobs. This came out November 14th. So where are we now? If you look at this map here, you may realize that this is the map from Fox News and the election results. But interestingly, folks, this is a very accurate map, for the most part, when it comes to the lockdowns throughout the United States. And what do I mean by that? There's a very good chance that if you are living in a blue state, you have a very strict lockdown or a much more strict lockdown than people in red states. Now, maybe you live in a red county in a blue state, and therefore you aren't experiencing as strict of a lockdown as people living in a blue county in a blue state. However, that isn't always the case, and I will share with you a couple exceptions here. Now, who is not locking down? Well, this story came out November 18th. Prepping for more lockdowns? If you're in Florida or Texas, there's no need. And why is that? Greg Abbott says no further lockdowns are coming to Texas. So as usual, Texas is the place to be. But if you're not in Florida or Texas, there's a good chance you've been told that you should host Thanksgiving dinner virtually or outside during coronavirus pandemic. So let's go ahead and check out the dictates from some governors around the nation, shall we? Inslee, Biden will spur commitment from Americans to get them to start wearing masks at home. Reconsider Thanksgiving plans. Now here is a red state. In Utah, what is going on in Utah? The governor declares emergency, issues mask mandate, and says we cannot afford to debate this issue. And cancel traditional Thanksgiving plans is what the mayor of Chicago says. Lori Lightfoot tells Chicagoans not to gather with family members, issues stay-at-home advisory. New Mexico governor issues stay-at-home order, closure of non-essential businesses. Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer orders another coronavirus lockdown. Broadway star and COVID-19 survivor Chad Kimball has sworn to, quote, respectfully disobey Washington state's restrictions against singing in church, saying that religious prohibitions represent an overreach of power by Governor Jay Inslee. who, by the way, supports the Council on American Islamic Relations, which pretty much lets you know, hey, you should just ignore everything that he says. Now, Ohio, another red state here, Governor DeWine announces 3-week COVID curfew. Good luck enforcing this. Pennsylvania mandating people wear masks inside their homes. In Minnesota, worst COVID lockdown yet, Dem governor bans gatherings inside of homes. Democrat tyrant Gavin Newsom issues 10 p.m. curfew for most California counties. New Hampshire Governor Chris Sununu, is that his name? Sununu? Imposes statewide mask mandate. And out of Oregon, Kate Brown wants people to snitch on neighbors who violate COVID rules. And if all that weren't enough as far as individual states, let's not forget this nationwide suggestion. Biden COVID advisory board member says indoor dining, gyms, and gatherings in homes should be targeted for closures. Now, folks, 19 lockdown Democrats who behave like the coronavirus isn't serious is the title of this article. So think about this, folks. The same politicians who are proudly pro-death on a year-round basis. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. Maybe I should use the euphemism abortion. Those who are pro-abortion on a year-round basis say these lockdowns are all about saving lives. But oddly, they don't seem to be concerned about their own. Another article touching on this point is Democrat governors are suicidal, or they don't believe in their own lockdowns. Now, no surprise, more and more people are waking up to this fact. This news story says, resistance to tyranny is being served for Thanksgiving 2020. And as it says at the bottom, resistance is a dish best served now. California legislatures, yes, people who can actually write laws and pass laws, advocate civil disobedience following new state COVID-19 restrictions. Every county sheriff in LA region declines to enforce Gavin Newsom's coronavirus curfew. Jim Jordan, don't cancel Thanksgiving, instead cancel lockdowns. Victor Davis Hanson predicts massive civil disobedience if more lockdowns are imposed. Because, as we see here, Richard Grinnell, this is what he tweeted, 6 people are allowed for Thanksgiving, but 30 are allowed for a funeral. So I will be holding a funeral for my pet turkey that will pass away on November 26th. Refreshments provided. But it's not just Thanksgiving. Our COVID police state wants to take Thanksgiving and Christmas away from you. CNN's Jake Tapper, Christmas is probably not going to be possible this year. Now, folks, we have here Franklin Graham has perfect response to CNN host suggestion that Christmas will not be possible this year. This weekend, CNN's Jake Tapper made the gloomy proclamation that Christmas is probably not going to be possible this year. I have news for him. Christmas is going to be celebrated by millions and millions of people around the world. The reason is that Christmas is not about gatherings and festivities, but it's about Jesus Christ. It's about God giving his Son, sending him to earth to save us from our sins. As Christians, we celebrate that God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. This is what Christmas is all about, and even COVID doesn't change that. Christmas celebrations may not be exactly the same this year, but for Christians, Christmas is in your heart. My prayer is that this Christmas, millions of people will turn to Jesus Christ and put their faith and trust in him as the pandemic continues to grip hearts around the world with fear and anxiousness. Now, here we have Dr. Anthony Fauci. Americans must do what you're told despite independent spirit. Now, this shouldn't be a surprise, though, because he also said, coronavirus not going to be a pandemic for a lot longer thanks to vaccines. But then again, hasn't that been the plan all along? Why would I say that? Let's continue. Denmark passes law enabling forced coronavirus vaccinations. Now, folks, that didn't come out last week. That came out March 16th, 8 months ago. Now, some people were saying, well, there is no vaccine. Folks, that article said that the law was put in place until March of 2021, so they had time to get one. And check out this video from Chicago.
And then finally, we'll be moving towards this mass vaccination campaign and continuing to follow. And I want you to know that CDPH is already deep in the planning stages around vaccination. We've already bought the syringes. We already know where it's going to happen. We're thinking about what that's going to be. It's all part of this plan.
All part of the plan. That video came out 6 months ago in May. And yet, new strains of COVID could render vaccines completely useless, and 2 dangerous mutations are already spreading. That's the title of this article. Now combine this with Fauci saying, social distancing and masks still necessary after getting coronavirus vaccine. Now folks, imagine number one, getting a vaccine for something that has already a 99% survival rate. And on top of that, still being told to social distance. And on top of that, still being told to wear a mask. Let's connect some more news stories. Ticketmaster to verify COVID vaccination status before issuing concert passes. Israel debuts dystopian surveillance system to enforce mask wearing and social distancing. Report, airlines to require health pass, quote unquote, vaccine certificate before allowing passengers to fly. Government's advisors suggest giving COVID-free Brits permission, quote unquote, wristbands. Top UK politician, workplaces, social venues may ban Britons without vaccination certificates. UK citizens could be banned from going into work, quote unquote, without proof of COVID vaccination. British government refuses to rule out mandatory vaccines, orders 5 million jabs from Moderna. Freedom Pass, please. Boris to introduce COVID passports as more lockdowns loom. South Australia enters another lockdown after just 36 new coronavirus infections. In other words, 36 new cases, not deaths, cases. But look at this. South Australia revokes draconian lockdown after revelation one person lied to contact tracers. It says here, the lockdown took effect yesterday and banned people from leaving their homes unless for emergency medical reasons or to buy food. Police even confirmed via Twitter that people who walked their dogs outside would be in violation of the law, prompting a huge backlash. And that backlash isn't just in tyrannical Australia. Check out this news story. Rising up, anti-lockdown protests spread across Europe. Germany, Spain, France, Italy, Slovakia, and Denmark, of all places. Now, a few minutes ago, I shared with you that news story out of Denmark 8 months ago on March 16th about the law that was passed enabling forced vaccinations. Well, check out this news story that came out a week ago. Forced vaccination law in Denmark abandoned after public protests. It says the epidemic law would have handed the Danish government the power to enact mandatory quarantine measures against anyone infected with a dangerous disease, but it was the part about vaccinations that caused the biggest uproar. And with that in mind, more than 2/3 of Americans oppose mandatory COVID-19 vaccinations. Now, last week, a news story came out which said, Trump COVID advisor, the only way this stops is if people rise up, which is why it's important to know that pandemics are over when the public decides they're over. That's the name of this article, which says, pandemics typically have two types of endings: the medical, which occurs when the incidence and death rates plummet, and the social, when the epidemic of fear about the disease wanes. When people ask, when will this end, they're asking about the social ending, said Dr. Jeremy Green, a historian of medicine at Johns Hopkins. In other words, an end can occur not because a disease has been vanquished, but because people grow tired of panic mode and learn to live with the disease. Folks, this is what you need to understand. The more fearful you are, the more likely you'll comply with their agenda. The worse your financial situation, the more likely you'll comply with their agenda. The more you miss how things used to be, quote unquote, the more you'll comply with their agenda. So remember, federal court announced on May 20th, there's no pandemic exception to the Constitution of the United States or the free exercise clause of the First Amendment. And COVID restrictions cannot exceed constitutional rights is the name of this article. Now, this was written by Chuck Norris, which means you need to read it, which means it's true. And doesn't Chuck Norris have about the same authority as the Supreme Court anyway? Well, according to some people. Now, what is Chuck Norris referring to here? He's referring to Justice Alito, who came out recently on November 13th and said religious liberty is in danger of becoming a second-class right. And folks, even if you want to wear a mask, even if you like wearing a mask, even if you need to wear a mask, check out this news story. School bans Jesus Loves Me face mask as offensive and disruptive. But it's not just face masks that you should be concerned about. It's also the churches throughout America. And you may have heard that John MacArthur's church over in Southern California, pastor to officials threatening jail, bring it on. In the face of fines, in the face of possible jail, Pastor John MacArthur was welcoming it. He said, bring it on. His church has not shut down. And you may not have heard, November 16th, LA County clears John MacArthur's megachurch and COVID-19 outbreak probe. It hasn't shut down, and there's no plans to shut down. And folks, this is why we need to make churches full again. Because let's bring up those polar opposite views. This is the worst disease in the history of the world, or it's the greatest hoax in the history of the world, or again, somewhere in between, to whatever degree you want to hold. If this is the worst disease in the history of the world, why would we allow people to die without Christ? People who die in their sins, who have never repented and put their trust in Christ, don't get a get-out-of-hell free card because they happen to die with COVID. People who die without Christ will end up in hell. So we need to make churches full again to let people know about Jesus and his great gospel. Now, what if this is the greatest hoax in the history of the world? Well, folks, what is happening around the world and the ultimate goal is satanic, it's totalitarian, it's tyrannical, it's dictatorial, etc. People need the gospel either way, right? So whether it's the greatest hoax, churches need to be full. They need to be proclaiming truth. If it's the greatest disease, churches need to be full and proclaim truth. And we will see you next time and talk with you next time on Radical Truth.